Hi, everybody. We're so glad that you've joined us on this call. My name is Karen Hangartner, and I'm the project director for the Southern Regional Children's Advocacy Center. And we're just kind of curious about how you're doing. That's become a very complex question in the age of COVID, hasn't it? I think we're finding that so many CAC staffs are juggling so many different things that it's just increased some of our anxiety and stress. So I'm just thrilled to be able to bring Diana Tikasz here for us today for a conversation. I met Diana last year at the International Symposium on Child Abuse, and I attended her workshop, and I was just really struck by the work that she was doing. And I had heard about the window of tolerance work before, but the way that she talked about it and explained it just was really like one of those aha moments for me. And I've been talking about it a lot in my STS trainings, and it just evokes a lot of really great conversations. And I love how Diana talks about things that we can do, practices that we can employ that don't necessarily take 30 or 45 minutes, that just small things that we can do in the course of our day can make a really big difference in our own resilience. So, Diana, we're thrilled to have you here. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. And why don't you start by just telling us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, Karen, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be here to speak with all of you also. Uh, I am a social worker by background, and my entire career, so the last 30 years, I've worked in the area of violence against women and children, which I know all of you on the call are familiar with. And I've always worked in a hospital setting, so I continue to work in a very large hospital, 13,000 staff. And over the course of doing my own trauma work, I, of course, have been no stranger to the experiences of secondary trauma. And out of that really arose an interest to really translate actually a lot of the things that I was learning and doing my trauma work, to translate that and make that applicable to those of us in the helping professions that are faced with secondary trauma and have real struggles in the impacts of that trauma exposure. So the past year, I have actually now moved into a new position at my hospital called the Resilience Integration Specialist, where it's my sole focus is on staff, team, and leadership resilience. So we're trying to actually shift the way in which we do our work, where we are integrating micro practices throughout the day so that we still have some juice left, some energy left at the end of the day. Because I think typically how we've looked at this issue has been from a self-care kind of model. And I think one of the challenges about the self-care model is it seems to be something that or the message is that this is something that we do on our own time, on the weekend or when we go on vacation, versus, weaving practices throughout the whole day. And so that's really how I like to look at this.
I think I had thought I'd heard this from Francoise Mathieu, which is a colleague of yours. I think it's worth noting too, Diana, that you're based at a hospital in Canada. Um, so that's I think that's an important thing to mention. But I thought it was Francoise that had said we can't wait till 5 o'clock and collapse on our yoga mats. And she said, no, that's your saying.
Yeah.
So tell us
Right.
that again.
About not collapsing on our yoga mats.
Yes.
Yes. So I was asked that. Francoise and I were doing a workshop together about a year ago, and somebody asked how much self-care should I be doing? And so my response was that it's I don't think it's helpful to go full throttle all day long and then collapse on our yoga mat at the end of the day and call that self-care. And so because I really am about all these little micro practices that we weave in. Um, so that, yeah, I can't say it any different, so that we have some energy left for our families, because oftentimes our families get what's left over, right? I mean, they get what's left over from, because we've given so much through the day. And I don't think anybody has I don't think we've been talking about this in our field, have been talking about it this way. I think, I think even now with, Francoise also says there's so many wonderful workshops and webinars that people are so generously offering. But Francoise says it's a little bit like drinking from a fire hose. There's so much coming at us. And so I find that challenging too, because it's even hard to learn something new when we're in an elevated stress situation. It's hard to learn something new. And so for me, it's about, let's not focus on something new per se, but let's build in what we already know, and let's start to weave it into how we navigate our day, so that we can be closer in our window of tolerance, which is certainly something I can then explain more.
Yeah. And before we talk about that, because that's my next question, but I've found it took me about a week and a half to realize that I was really kind of stuck in that fight mode. But as I've been talking to people since then, it's worth remembering that we've been talking about secondary traumatic stress in the CAC world for quite a while now. And I think there are some people and some organizations that have done a really good job of developing some practices that promote their own resilience. But it's like COVID happened, and we just are like, why, we know nothing about trauma anymore. And yeah, there are some things that are unique to the COVID crisis that we're dealing with, but at the same time, we know trauma and we know what we should be doing. And I think somehow we just forgot about that in the CAC world.
Well, I think we forgot about that, yeah, right across right across the board. And I noticed it for me as we were gearing up to start to address the surge that we knew was gonna, or that we felt was gonna hit our hospitals, is that everybody was just in this supercharged mode that we were forgetting some of the basics that we would do. And so one of the basics that actually we do is a pausing practice, which I'm actually going to do with us right now,
Oh,
because
cool.
it really was highlighted to me that the days that I got swept up in the reactivity, right, and the activity and reactivity, if I didn't build in pauses like I usually do, those days just went like a runaway train. When I realized this and started to purposefully not only slow myself down into pausing, but start each webinar, each Zoom with a pausing practice, even though everybody was anxious to get going, we actually got a lot more work done, and left the meeting feeling a lot more connected and productive than what we were doing previously. So I'm just going to give you a little example, and we'll take 1 or 2 minutes to begin with a pause, just so that you get a kind of feel for this, and then you can maybe play with it on your own. So I'm going to invite everyone on the call to just take a few moments to deepen and lengthen their breathing. And as you come into stillness, you may wish to do this with eyes closed or having a soft gaze. And just spend a few moments expanding the breath, noticing the quality of your presence, noticing the quality of your breath. And we don't need to judge it in any way. Simply notice. And just taking a moment to fully arrive into your body. Perhaps noticing for the first time today that you actually have a body. That there may be places of tension. There may be places of tightness. Simply notice those places and see if there's any desire to soften, even just a little bit. And now allowing your breath to find its own natural rhythm, letting go of any control of your breath. And shifting your attention from the body to the area of your heart space, which I often think about as being in the center of my chest. And I invite you to set an intention for this webinar, for how you wish to be in this moment and the next moments as you proceed through the webinar. And so you may wish to connect with a quality of openness or presence, or maybe even kindness for yourself as you recognize how stressful it has been on you and your body. And so simply just set that intention for whatever it may be. And simply wish for yourself a statement like, may I be open, or may I be fully present, or may I know that I am doing the best I can, or that I am enough in the midst of all this turmoil, or that I know about trauma and how to cope. Whatever it is, whatever quality, whatever intention you wish for yourself, do that now. And then taking a fuller, deeper breath and refocusing back into our presentation. So I hope that maybe helped us fully get into this moment and prepare ourselves for what's to come.
Oh, that's such a wonderful practice and reminder. I do think, and I was asking you before we started about how many Zoom calls are we on a day, and I find myself going from one to another. And so what a great way to just get in and be present for this one. So I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about the windows of tolerance, the window of tolerance. I think that is such a, well, for me, it was just a revolutionary concept to think about.
Okay. All right. So I'd love to do that. So what I'm going to do actually to do that is speak a little bit more about the brain and our neurophysiology. So probably a warning I should have given right at the start is I am a little bit of a brain nerd. Now I don't want anybody to worry or run screaming out of the room. I don't have higher than a grade 9 science background, so I'm not going to speak over anybody's head. I came to be a brain nerd because I was actually really struggling with trying to understand trauma, whether it be primary trauma or secondary trauma, because I could see how we could get quite stuck in trauma. And so what the neuroscience field has contributed to that, I have found hugely helpful. And so I'm really going to be relying on the work of Dr. Dan Siegel, which many of you may know as he is a psychiatrist, a child psychiatrist, and he has written many, many books in the area. He's also a big mindfulness person, and so I too am a mindfulness teacher. I think it's just a very grounding practice, and so I'm going to borrow on some of his information. And so I think I'm going to take us to, let's see, no, let's go to this slide. So I want to talk a little bit about the brain, the handy model of the brain, which is based on Dr. Dan Siegel. And so I will use my, whoops, let me just get my camera right here. I will use my fist here to explain this. And I know, Karen, you started to do this a little bit with the presentation with Francoise. And so
Not nearly as well as you will, though.
well, we'll see. But I think repetition is also helpful. So the reason I say this, and actually maybe I'm right-handed, so let me try to, yeah, that feels more comfortable to me. What I'll say as well, repetition is important because of the neuroplasticity piece. So we know about neuroplasticity, which says that our brain continues to grow and develop as long as we are firing firing the neurons we want to fire. So repetition helps because what that says is that we will groove in new neural networks with small and often, small and often, small and often, which also speaks to why I like micro practices, because we are doing those small and often rather than once a week for an hour. Okay, so so here we go. So let's see. Yeah, there we go. There's my hand. So so what this says here, and what Dr. Dan Siegel says, is if we think about the brain having kind of evolved in 3 stages. At my wrist is the brain stem, which is the most primitive part of the brain. Is so primitive we sometimes refer to it as reptilian brain, but it's in charge of very important things like heart rate and breath rate. When I open up my hand, in here is the midbrain, or the limbic area of the brain, and the thumb is very important here. The thumbnail in particular, there we go, is the amygdala. The amygdala is like our smoke alarm. It's always on alert for danger. It's seeking things out, and as soon as it sniffs out some smoke or some danger, it sounds the alarm, which gets the cascade of fight, flight, freeze hormones in motion. When I close up my hand, up here is the most evolved part of the brain, the neocortex. All the characteristics that make us most human are up here. So our language center's up there. Right behind my knuckles, right behind our foreheads here, is the prefrontal cortex. So that's the part of the brain, as many know, that is in charge of decision making, of problem solving. Our executive functioning is up there, our impulse control. It is also connected to our compassion and empathy. So really important part of the brain. And what I'm going to say as well is everything from here down is non-conscious. Up here is where we have more conscious control. So I'm going to just say a little bit more here, not about this right now. So if we take the rest of my arm, let me get that on there here, as being the rest of our body, because our brain and our nervous system doesn't just stop up here. We also have a complex system running through our body of nerves. And so the autonomic nervous system has 2 components. There's the sympathetic, which is our energy, which gets fight, flight, freeze, and in motion. And there's parasympathetic, which is our rest and digest, which is where we should be essentially most of the time. We are built to be in parasympathetic activity most of the time. However, in times of crisis, we tend towards being in sympathetic activity, but we need to, our rest state is in parasympathetic. So that's kind of important to know as well in terms of the whole fight flight response. And I'm doing this, right? Because what happens is when we get activated, when we get really strongly activated in our fight flight response, what we can do is we can do what's called a lid flip, where we disconnect. We're actually disconnecting from the thinking brain. Now, we may think that this is really weird because at times of crisis, I need my thinking brain. So why is it evading me? Well, we got to look at our history in terms of human evolution. If we take it back to the savannah, where we well, where we existed for most of human history, it makes sense because if the saber-toothed tiger was in front of us, if we stood there and thought, what do I do now? Do I run? Do I hide? Do I talk to it? We would have been lynched. So this part of the brain gets out of the way and we go purely into reactive mode. And so I also want to say that we actually, I don't think it's either this or this. I think what also can happen is we can do partial disconnection. Okay, and this is where the window of tolerance comes in, is that we may not be doing a complete lid flip. And so I'll get back to that in 1 second. I want to say one more thing with this slide here. I also want to say that there is a perceptive quality to our stress response. So what I mean by that is that the amygdala certainly is always on alert for danger. However, there are two pathways in the brain, and I'm going to just use this illustration here to explain these two pathways. One is very fast and one is slower. The fast pathway goes from the amygdala down through our nervous system, okay, and it halts the body. So for example, or it halts the body, or it already gets us into reactive mode before we even know what's going on. So the example I'll give is if I'm walking in the woods and there is a squiggly thing in front of me, my body, the amygdala will pick it up, my body will halt right away, because it's gone through that fast pathway. I'll stop before I even know what that squiggly thing is. Simultaneously, more information is coming in, and a second pathway, a longer pathway, which we refer to as the high road. The short pathway is the low road. The high road goes up to the prefrontal cortex, where it is appraising, what do I know about squiggly things in the woods? And so if the information that's coming in says, oh, this is that squiggly thing, it's not moving and it's gray, oh, it must be a vine, then my prefrontal cortex is going to send a message to the amygdala to say, oops, false alarm, and then I'm going to go back to normal physiological state. If, however, the information comes through and this is a squiggly thing, it's moving, it has brown spots on it, and there's a rattling sound coming from the end, then my prefrontal cortex is going to say to the amygdala, yep, this is big time danger. And so at that point, then it might ignite a whole lid flip, because it's just amplifying that stress response. So why I'm saying this is because our thoughts, our ability to think, can actually amplify our stress response. If we are circulating in worry, or if we go into really kind of catastrophize, what if, right, and go into worst case scenario, that can amplify our thoughts. So to bring it now to your question of the window of tolerance, a long about way. So let me now with that background, get to this window of tolerance, as you can see up on the screen now. So the window of tolerance is an emotional band. And it's an emotional band, as you can see here. It's an emotional band, let me show it this way, that I can go up and down in and still function effectively. Sometimes the example I give is say I'm in the middle of my window when I'm having a conversation with my spouse in my green zone. When we are in our green zone, that's where we're the best version of ourselves. We are calm, we are collected, we are present, we can think well, we can problem solve. It's all coming together for us. And so I'm in the window when I start this conversation with my husband or my spouse. And all of a sudden the conversation turns to finances. So what starts to happen is that I'm getting, this is like back and forth which way, it's all, it's messing with my brain here, is I start to climb in my window. So I start to climb into hyperarousal. So those fight flight responses of maybe frustration or anxiety or worry. If I'm not aware that I'm climbing up in my window, what can happen is I can be in danger of popping out of my window. If I've popped completely out of my window, I've done a lid flip. I'm no longer connected to my thinking part of the brain. And I know when I've done a lid flip after the fact, because that's when I realize that I have said or done something that I regret later. So the idea is, and I use the window of tolerance as a self-monitoring tool for me, a continuous self-monitoring tool. So I am throughout the day checking in with my window. Where am I? Am I spinning up towards hyperarousal, or am I starting to fall down into hypoarousal? Those are more the symptoms of what we call freeze or collapse response, the numbing, the withdrawal, the shutdown. And so I could go either way, and we'll go either way based on the situation. Let me just say one more thing. If I go back to that diagram about the snake, so the other thing that's interesting here is if I in the woods, if I have had a prior experience with a snake, say I was bitten by a snake before, I'm actually going to probably go into a freeze response even more quickly because I have that history, and that's gotten stuck in my amygdala. And so I may have even a bigger response than I likely will than somebody who has not ever been bitten by a snake. So that all relates. That anyway, that gives some information in terms of how we can go up and down in the window. And so for me, I want to be aware when I'm climbing or when I'm dropping or disconnecting, so that I can do these micro practices that bring me closer in my window, and really try to, as much as possible, avoid those lid flips.
Yeah, so I love that. And one of the things that struck me when I heard you talked about this, and as I've been talking about it since then, is that hypoarousal thing. I think for so many people in our field, and not just in the CAC world, but our multidisciplinary teams, that part of what happens is we don't go home and collapse on our yoga mat, but our idea of recharging is I just need to sit in the recliner. I don't want to talk to anybody, and with the remote control and just aimlessly flip it. And that struck me as that's probably the hypoarousal that's happening there, right?
Yeah. Yeah, often it can be our hypoarousal where we shut down, we're numb. I actually am I'm usually more concerned for folks in when they go into that hypoarousal space, because I think we can interpret that as sometimes as strength or being stoic, or people are coping. It's maybe a little bit similar to children at school. That the children that are in hyperarousal are the ones that are getting the attention. The ones that are quiet and withdrawn don't necessarily get the attention, but are also perhaps are often also struggling with trauma. So yeah, very much so. Thinking that we are, so that this is another interesting thing you raised with the question, is thinking that we are recharging when we are, plunked in front of the TV. And don't get me wrong, I also do that distraction activity. However, I think where we have to make the distinction is that it is a distraction, and it is a way that we disconnect. I think what's different and with something that is actually recharging or refueling or replenishing is that there is a quality of presence to those activities that we don't have when we are passively kind of disconnecting or distracting. And so I will sometimes purposely choose to, I'm just going to binge watch a couple of episodes of this on Netflix. But I'm making the decision, and I'm doing it for a limited period of time versus that becoming my sole way of coping. I want to try to make sure that I'm engaging in other strategies that actually fuel me, fill me up, help me feel connected within myself, with others, and that are energizing. That are energizing.
I think that's one of the things, because somebody asked me that in a training, how do you know the difference between what's hypoarousal and what's self-care? And quite honestly, I wasn't real sure of the answer, but the only thing I could come up with was I would think if it's something that is refueling you, then that is about you. It's then that's when after you do it, you think, man, I didn't really want to go to the gym, but I feel so much better now that I've done it.
Yes.
That it's like when you finish whatever that activity is, you do feel better and more refueled, and much less like I'm still as exhausted as I was beforehand.
Well, exactly, right? And sometimes conversations are like that. We think we're going to connect with a colleague, and what we end up doing is just marinating in negativity because just this complaining conversation, and we walk away feeling worse rather than recharged, right? So that is another example of where I don't think we're actually truly connecting and shifting out of a state that isn't particularly helpful. And I think this is also where the whole concept for me of resilience comes in. And the whole thing for me about resilience, actually, maybe I'll just go back to my introductory slide here. I don't know if folks can see the image. That's actually a picture that I took when I was vacationing in Hawaii a couple of years ago. And my practice would be, my routine would be to go out to the beach every morning and watch the sun come up. And it had been a full moon the night before, so the tide had been out further. And what I saw there were these lava rocks, and in the midst of that one lava rock is a little heart-shaped red lava rock. And I thought it was such a beautiful image of resilience, because here are these waves crashing over this rock, but the rock is steady, and it has that solid heart in the middle of it. And so this is kind of how I view resilience, is that it's our ability to kind of be grounded, solid, steady, and be able to even adapt in the midst of stresses. But I also see it as so it's not just our ability to bounce back, which is often the common definition, but there's also something called post-traumatic growth that I think many are familiar with. But I'm always surprised, and I actually let me have a little slide here on post-traumatic growth. I'm always surprised with I will ask when I do presentations, how many folks are familiar with post-traumatic stress? And of course, every hand in the room goes up. And then I ask folks, how many people are familiar with post-traumatic growth? And much fewer hands go up. And it's interesting because there's very rigorous research on post-traumatic growth, and by far anywhere from half to 80% of us will come out of an adverse experience in a place of post-traumatic growth versus post-traumatic stress. And so essentially what post-traumatic growth talks about here is just that, our ability to grow in ways, and not that we ever want an adverse or traumatic situation to happen to anyone, but it doesn't mean that game is over, because if we have one happening, because it actually can help us in finding our new normal, to develop and grow in ways that that may not have happened or happened in the same way otherwise. And so I think these five results of post-traumatic growth are something that I try to, on a day in and day out basis and through micro practices actually cultivate. Because I think we have also something that I like to call a resilience bank. And so I think anytime we engage in activities of connection, say, or a moment where we're really savoring an experience of gratitude or hope or an appreciation. That these are things that actually go into, we absorb them. We absorb them in our nervous system. They go into our resiliency bank, and we can draw upon those during times of difficulty and challenge. So I like to even think about, as we go through this pandemic, how we are also setting things up and cultivating so that we are setting up the post-traumatic growth. Because I do think times of challenge can also make us open to doing things in a new way. Doing things in a new way, trying things that we wouldn't have tried before, making changes in our life in a way that can serve us long after the crisis is over.
And that stimulates a couple of things in my mind. And one is, in the CAC world, we get to see some of this post-traumatic growth in the kids that and families that we're working with, especially our therapists, because they're able to see the healing that takes place. And I know a lot of our centers, they make sure that the entire multidisciplinary team is exposed to the post-traumatic growth of clients. So they may have not seen that kid in 6 months, but they've been in therapy. And so, the CLC will bring this kid back up. You remember this kid, this case? Well, look at this kid now. And it is that. And so part of my concern is that some of that probably, or I think, does fuel our compassion satisfaction. We've taken that away during the age of COVID,
Yes.
which is a little concerning. And I think that we have to just reimagine that, or maybe exactly like you say, we have to develop a new way of, tuning into that in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing it brings up for me, which is connected, but I think it's time for us to start having conversations about, yes, this has been a collective trauma globally. But there are probably some things that we've learned through this experience, and some practices that we might want to consider to continue. And I think these micro practices that you talk about, that I want us to delve into in a minute, are exactly that. In this post-traumatic growth seems to provide really almost a roadmap for folks to be able to tap into that.
Mm-hmm.
Here are the things, here's what I appreciate about life now that I discovered because I've been working at home for the last 6 weeks with my family. Here are the priorities that are changed that I've been, able to think about and process in a different way. So I think that is so incredibly empowering, to be quite honest. And I think so many of us have felt helpless during this COVID response, and this is something that really empowers us. So talk a little bit about those micro practices, if you will.
Sure, I would love to. Maybe what I'll do here is I'll talk a little bit about what we've been pulling together at our hospital, because it is based on these micro practices. And then I will, there's a couple of things then that I also would like to do with folks on the call. But let me see where. Oh, wonderful. So there it is. So what we've done at our hospital is we have created a framework that we are calling Pause, Reset, and Nourish. And so those initials are actually quite purposeful in the healthcare field, because what they stand for is PRN. And so some of you may know this, but what PRN means is the short form for in healthcare is as needed. And so the whole idea behind this strategy is to help folks engage in practices as needed. So to do these practices, to weave these practices throughout the day. And so the foundation is that those who decide, like folks that decide to work in the helping professions, are inherently resilient and resourceful people. That's, I think, what that's part of what draws us into our work. And so we have all found ways to navigate our work, even though sometimes we may lose a track a little bit, or lose our way. But we all inherently have resources and tools that we use. And so this framework is simply to help people, remind people to develop the habit of doing micro practices. And so one of the things we're hoping we will do is so in the healthcare world, at morning huddle, we will do a little pausing practice. So at the start of meetings, you can do pausing practices. We want to make little stickers that we put on the hand sanitizers, so that every time, we go and sanitize our hands, we're taking a moment to pause. So what you do here is you pause, and a little bit like our practice that we did at the start. So we pause and we just check in with ourselves, so we can think about this as window of tolerance. What's here for me right now? What am I noticing in my body? Because my body is a very good barometer for my stress level. So if I'm noticing that as I pause, my shoulders are up here, right? That gives me some indication of what's going on for me. And maybe the reset is simply doing this, right? Or as I pause, I notice that my breath is non-existent. So let me just deepen my breathing. Right? Maybe I notice that in my emotion, I'm feeling quite anxious. So maybe my little reset will be, okay, I'm going to run up and down the stairs at my house, even, right? Or do a couple jumping jacks in place to just release some of that energy. So it's getting into the habit of pausing. What's here for me now? And we don't judge it. So that's the other thing, right? Because remember that second pathway that I told you that goes through the prefrontal cortex. If I pause and I notice that I'm anxious, and then I start to say, well, what business do I have being anxious? I'm safe at my home. There's all kinds of other people that are really sick, or what have you. Then what I'm doing is I'm actually feeding that stress response and amplifying it. And so it really is, and this is a tricky one for me, because I realized how judgy I can be in my own head. And so noticing when I'm being judgy actually now becomes my little flag to pause and reset. Okay, so I pause, I do a little reset, whatever that might be, and I will, so it might be breath, it might be some other things. I want to do a little resourcing exercise with folks in a bit. So I do my little reset, and then I check in with myself again in that nourishing piece. So I'm going to recheck in. So has anything shifted? Maybe yes, maybe no. I would suspect something will likely shift, even just a little bit. And so I really want to take a moment to soak that in. I want to soak that in, because I want to really notice I have just taken a moment to do something good for myself. Doing something good for myself is doing something good for someone else. So let me explain the neuroscience behind that a little bit. So many of you may know that we have something called a negativity bias. And so what this negativity bias says, and I'll explain it this way. We have inherited the gene pool of all our pessimistic ancestors, because the optimistic ancestors were quite literally eaten by the saber-toothed tigers on the savannah, because they were not on the lookout for danger. So we have a nervous system now that will register a negative instantaneously. For us to, a positive, let me put it this way, a positive, we actually have to focus on for about 20 seconds for it to register as significantly as a negative does instantaneously. So that nourish piece is really important because we want to actually absorb the little bit of good, the little micro practice that we've done. We want to absorb it that so that it sticks. Okay, so and in this way, and in doing these micro practices, we are actually rewiring out of that negativity bias. And the other thing I'll say is that when we nourish ourselves, when we engage in acts of compassion, whether they be compassion towards others, to self, or even witnessing acts of compassion, um, we actually release a neurohormone or hormone called oxytocin. And oxytocin is a bonding hormone, is our feel-good hormone, and it actually counteracts adrenaline and cortisol. And so we're dosing ourselves with a really good helpful hormone. So anyway, all the practices are much shorter than me being able to explain them, but all that to say that really the pause, reset, nourish is a framework for us to be able to embed things that we already know how to do. And it also is flexible enough to add new practices into. And so I know you've put the link up for the website on the hospital. If folks go in there, they will see there's additional practices in there on body practices, connection practices, mind practices, and we'll probably be continuing to build those. But those are ideas that that people can just build into this.
And I have to say that is an amazing resource for folks. So yeah, we're going to make sure that people have access to that website because it's incredible. You know, one of the things that I think we often find in the CAC world is my executive director, Chris Newland, talks about we have this kind of martyrdom or this spirit of sacrifice that, you know, who are we to go and take a week of vacation? Children may be dying in our communities. And I think that's something that's real for people. And like you say, those of us in the helping professions, often it is about it's almost this feeling of guilt of making yourself a priority and making your own self-care a priority. But I often tell people not everybody can do the work that we do in the CAC world. Not everybody can sit in a room and listen to a child disclose their sexual abuse. And so for those people who can do that, I really feel like it's an ethical obligation that we see to our own wellness because not everybody can do it. And, you know, it's almost like for Olympic athletes, if you have that gift, there's almost like this inherent responsibility that comes with it that you do what's within your power to do so that that practice is sustainable for you.
Right. Absolutely. And with that Olympic athlete, right, they are engaging in their exercise and their training on a daily basis. And somehow we think that that attending to ourselves is taking away from others, but I actually think attending to ourselves is one of the most generous things that we can do for others because and we've certainly learned this in healthcare, that the wellness of the practitioner is directly related to the wellness of the patient. They are two sides of the same coin, because if there is a practitioner who's disconnected, let me put it that way, because of their own suffering or struggles, they're gonna miss stuff with the patient. And so the other thing is that I think presence is to be present is such a key to our work. And
Mm.
compassion fatigue, and that's a term that's come out of favor for good reasons. But one of the things I used to say is that I would have called it compassion disconnection versus compassion fatigue, because I think what happens is, in our unconscious attempts as helpers to protect ourselves from stories of suffering and loss, we unconsciously disconnect from the very tools that we need to do our helping work. And why compassion fatigue is misnamed is because compassion is actually the road back. If Compassion is a very energizing emotion, and we can see this actually in fMRI imaging machines, is that when somebody does an active compassion practice, which is wishing well, and I'm going to actually, let me go to, I want to teach everyone this little strategy. That's an amazing strategy. Um, but when somebody goes in who's actively engaging in compassion or wishing others well, I'll put it that way, what happens is that the motor planning centers of the brain light up. So we see that it is energizing. There's a difference between compassion and empathy. And I think, unfortunately, historically, what we've been teaching, and I know this at least in healthcare, we've been teaching people to be empathic, do empathic listening. And the thing with empathy alone is that means we are feeling with the other person. We are feeling what they're feeling. Of course, that is draining. Compassion is different in that we are recognizing the suffering of the other, and there is a combination of wanting to have a desire. There's a desire to want to alleviate that suffering, so there's an action component to it. And I will say, even in moments where where we cannot make it better for the other person. So I have, as many of you on this webinar will have had, moments where you are hearing something so horrific that there are no words for it. There is nothing that we can say or do to make it better for the person. But I will say, we can always be in compassion. We can always sit in compassion with that person. We can, and so I will do this. I will sit, and I will actually, I will do a double thing. I will breathe in for myself to help keep myself kind of spacious and expanded, so that I can be in the presence of the suffering. And I will breathe out for the other person. So I'm doing this in my own mind. I'm not, saying this. I'm breathing in for me, breathing out for the other, and I might be wishing the other well, in terms of, may you find strength in this moment. May your I don't know, may you be kind to yourself. Whatever it is. I mean, I do this too. I live on the flight path for the trauma helicopters, for the trauma hospital, and the orange helicopters. I don't know if they're orange in the US as well, but they're orange here. And every time I hear this trauma helicopter go by, or an ambulance go by, I send a little well wish. May you be well. May your family find strength in this moment. Um, because I do think it puts an energy out there, and it puts an energy out there, and it also puts an energy in for me to be able to be kind of solid and grounded. So I'll pause there before I talk about the self-compassion break, to see if there's something you might want to say to that, Karen.
Yeah, I'm struck with, I think sometimes when people are either their lids flipped or partially flipped, they could hear or see that helicopter and think, oh no, that's one more trauma victim, that's one more whatever, and go to that more negative place. And so I like how that just automatically puts you into a more positive mindset that is empowering,
Mhm.
because it's one thing to hear those helicopters and think it's another trauma victim, nothing I can do about it, and we feel powerless,
Yes.
which I think is such a big piece of trauma and secondary traumatic stress that that's empowering. That is something that I can do.
Mhm.
So I like that. The other thing that what you were saying hits for me, our colleague Brian Miller, who I think um, he always has an issue with that whole metaphor of the hazmat
Mhm.
suit, that to do this work we need to put on the hazmat suit to be able to do it. And he said we've gotten that wrong. What we need to be doing is taking the gloves off and getting more in touch with how this work is impacting us instead of protecting ourselves from it, to lean into it and to be aware of it.
Yes. So the neurophysiology, I would say, around that, right, is that again that negativity. But so for both points that you made, is that we are going to quite naturally in those moments we can go into that negativity bias, right? I sometimes talk about it like if somebody cuts me off in traffic, my first reaction might be you so and so, right? Um, but I now again use that as a flag to, because that was my amygdala speaking. But let me keep my prefrontal cortex on board. So if I can engage my prefrontal cortex, I'm less likely to do a complete lid flip, right? And we've seen people in other cars do complete lid flips, and it gets quite dangerous, right? And so if
Yeah.
I can use that as a signal to myself that, okay, that was my amygdala speaking, that was my downstairs brain, that was my neurophysiology. So here's another quote I absolutely love, and I think it was Paul Gilbert who said it, but what it is it's not my fault, but it is my responsibility. So it's not my fault that I went into this negativity bias, but it is my responsibility as I become aware of it to do something about it. And so what this says to me then is I can take responsibility then for, all right, let me shift it. Let me go into well wishes for this person that's just cut me off in traffic. And what I'll do is I'll say, okay, maybe you're in a big hurry. Maybe you have to rush to the hospital. May you be safe as you get there. May the people around you be safe as you get there. And so that's the place I want to shift into. And in terms of the hazmat suit, I think I think really what's important in taking the gloves off is this piece of how I describe it is making us more spacious and spacious to be in the presence of suffering. So that's taking the gloves off because when we go into fight flight reaction, that is a contraction. That's where we collapse. We get, and that's where I think stuff sticks to us more. If we can make ourselves spacious enough, we can move things. We can move it through. We can move it up and out a little easier. Is what I think. So that's kind of how I look at it. And so how I make myself spacious is with my breath, is with connecting to compassion, to gratitude, to knowing what's within my locus of control, those kinds of things. And so this is where I found the self-compassion break hugely helpful. And I'll let you speak again before I then will go take us through this practice.
I know you can tell that I'm dying to say something. That quote is amazing. So say that quote one more time.
It's not our fault, but it is our responsibility.
So I was doing some work on a presentation around STS, and have kind of been grouping things and in some primary prevention, secondary prevention, tertiary prevention to prevent secondary traumatic stress. Something I kept bumping up against, though, was that yes, you can have a plan of how you're going to include these micro practices, of how you're going to show yourself self-compassion or others' compassion. But if you don't choose to activate that, if you don't choose to take responsibility for employing the tools that you've been given, there's only so much that others can do for you. And I think sometimes when we talk about, I believe strongly, and I know you do too, there's an organizational responsibility um, for organizations to create environments that promote resilience and that are supportive. But there's also an individual responsibility to utilize the tools once I know what those tools are. So that quote speaks to that so directly about, yeah, it's not my fault. I do have a responsibility in this. So I love that.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And I think it is a nice way to balance that, to balance what you've talked about, to balance the recognition that we have bodies and we're human beings first. So there can also even be moments where we have a good practice and we do everything right, that we might still lid flip. And just a sec, I've lost my screen. It'll come back on, I hope. I know you can see me, but anyway, I don't know if you can see my hand. But where
we can see you.
okay, so where we might still lid flip, but again, right, when we recognize that, that becomes our cue to actually sorry, I'm a little thrown off because I have a black screen in front of me right now, but it becomes a cue for us to take some responsibility to get down closer into our window.
Yeah, and so I think we've all been on enough Zoom calls now to understand unstable connections and people dropping out. Somebody actually passed around a Zoom bingo card that had things like, "Can you hear me now?" or "You're muted, unmute yourself." It's become quite comical, I think, for ourselves. But without your screen,
Yes.
is it possible for you to walk us through this self-compassion break that you were talking about?
It is. So, okay. So you'll see up on the 3 steps of self-compassion. So this is the wonderful work of Dr. Kristen Neff and Dr. Christopher Germer. So I am actually a mindful self-compassion teacher. I have found this to be quite life-changing for me. You can go on the selfcompassion.org website, Dr. Kristen Neff's website. She's the foremost researcher in the area of self-compassion. And there's even a little test there because she's a researcher. You can do a little test about how self-compassionate you are, and then start to engage in some of these practices to develop, to kind of hone your skills, and then do the post test again to see where you're at. So if you're a little bit, pre-post test scientifically minded, you can do that. And why I say that is because I know for myself, and many people I think who do helping work, is that we can be our own worst enemies. We can have such big inner critics. And I think this is maybe also where guilt can come in, is that because we are so hard on ourselves. And so what I like about the self-compassion break and self-compassion practices is what they actually do is they help us to be in the presence of difficult emotions. And so the self-compassion break is quite simple, and it goes along the lines of the 3 components of self-compassion. So what the steps are is that first we become aware that become mindful that this is a moment of suffering. And so maybe let me give you, what can I give you an example? Let me talk about. So a few years ago, I was doing a presentation, and I had at that point been doing self-compassion practice for a while. And what had happened is it was the start of the presentation. It was a crowded room. It was a jam-packed room, and I was about 20 minutes into the presentation. And of course, you know, as is in a crowded room, that when somebody comes in late, often the only spaces that are left are up front, at the very front, in front of the presenter. And so this woman came in rushed, and it really does not bother me when people come in late, because I understand there's traffic challenges and home challenges and so on. And so truly I was trying to do an act of kindness and direct her to the only seat that was left that happened to be in front of me. And what happened was that she, because she was so stressed, she came barreling down the aisle, the laneway, just angry, 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 and really yelling at me about how dare I call her out in the middle of this presentation, and so on and so forth. And so I noticed that immediately my hand went to my chest. And so what happened, as my hand went to my chest, that's kind of my anchor. That's my gesture that I do around self-compassion. And so what I was actually thrilled that that had happened, because it helped to steady me. And oh, there, finally, you're all back. It's taken that long to get you. Okay, so it steadied me. And I went into very quickly in the midst of this, because I went into these 3 steps, because if I didn't, if I would have done a lid flip in that moment, I wasn't going to be a very effective presenter. So so it's just noticing in that moment. And actually I did it more so with the gesture in that example, because my body was already familiar. But what the steps are is we recognize that this is a moment of suffering. So we acknowledge what's here. We label the emotion that is here. And we do that with presence, with mindfulness. Simply labeling, and there is very good research out there that shows when we label an emotion, we are engaging the prefrontal cortex. It is going to help us keep this rather than doing this, right? So we label, grief is here, or this is a moment of worry or anxiety, or this is a moment of guilt. I like to word it as this is a moment of, so that I am not over identifying with my emotion. I don't want to say I'm angry, right? Because that's not my whole identity. This is a moment of, which reminds me that it's going to pass. Okay.
Right.
The second piece is the connection piece, or what I sometimes call normalizing. Is just saying that, you know, this is part of how we're wired up as people. In a pandemic situation, we're all going to struggle with fears and anxieties. That's just how we're wired up as a human species. Doing that helps us to remember that we are not alone in our suffering. Every single human being on the planet has had some experience of suffering. And so in that way, we feel connected to others and not isolated. And then the third piece, the self-kindness piece. So if everybody on the webinar now thinks about the last time they made a mistake, and how did you talk to yourself the last time you made a mistake? And for many of us, right, we talk to ourselves in a way that we wouldn't even dream of speaking to our worst enemy in that way. Yet we talk to ourselves in this way, and we somehow think that that's going to be helpful. And so what I want to say is that just doses us with more stress hormones. I mean, we don't talk to our loved ones that way, because we know that that's not going to be motivating. We're not going to say, "You stupid dummy, what were you thinking?" But we often will talk that way to ourselves. So that third piece, that self-kindness piece, is simply talking to ourselves in a way we would talk to a good friend or a child or a loved one who had the same problem. And so we just shift in our tone, we shift in our approach to ourselves. And once we get practiced in that, we can do it instantaneously, like I did in that moment when the woman was barreling down the aisle at me saying, how dare I treat her this way in front of everybody. And just that simple
Mm.
gesture for me just grounded me and helped me send myself some compassion and this woman. And by the way, at break time we worked it out, and she we became friends. And I had to give her a lot of credit because she was willing to stay and be present and absorb what was being said. And she actually said it was one of the most helpful presentations. So I'm glad we made friends at the end of it. But this is how how I need to weave in practices throughout the day.
Yeah, and it's so funny when you said that. I could immediately think of how many CAC staff can think of a time that somebody in an MDT meeting, one of our MDT partners, made their lids are flipped, you know, and so I'm sure that that image is popping up for some of our CAC folks.
Yeah. And can I say something to that too? Because
Sure.
the other thing I think around the neurobiology of interpersonal neurobiology is that when we have a flipped lid, right, that fear response can be contagious. That negativity response can be contagious.
Yeah.
But so can compassion and so can calmness. And so if we can, and so this is part of what I'm also trying to help us do at the hospital is if I go into a stressful meeting, and so it's a little more challenging when we're doing these things virtually, right? But I still think we can do that with tone and with seeing each other. Is if I can be in that calmer place, if I can be in the middle of my window, that's going to start to be contagious too, to start to radiate out. So,
Mm.
and that's why again, I think these practices are not selfish. They are very, very generous.
Oh yeah, I love that. And it's kind of like, you know, think about when you're raising kids, when your kids are upset, you need to be more and more calm because it does trigger them. So yeah, I just love that, Diana. I think that's very important information for us. And I also liked when you said, when you talked about naming what you're feeling. Um, Oftentimes, you know, whenever I'm doing training around secondary traumatic stress, I talk about and name some different concepts because I do think, you know, like moral distress, it needs a name. Most people are experiencing it, but they don't know what to call it. And when you don't know what to call something, I think it just makes you reactive.
Yeah.
Um,
The other thing is it relates to that second step, that connection piece. If we don't know what to call it, then we think we're the only ones going through it. And so when there's a name, there's also some validation that it's not just me. And in the therapy world, and many of you may know this saying, right? We name it to tame it. We feel it to heal it, right? These are little quips that are actually, they're quippy, but they're also very, very true.
yeah, 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 I think that's great. And I often feel like one of the most, maybe one of the only beneficial things that comes out of training around secondary traumatic stress is people can relate to that and it validates what they're feeling. And I think that's particularly appropriate right now. You know, I know we're having some conversations in our field around, you know, I, I'm just fuzzy headed. I can't focus as long or as well as I could before all of this hit. And so I think this is a great, um, again, framework for people to be able to use to kind of counteract that. And so, you know, so much of what we're doing is trying to enhance connections so that people can see that they're not isolated. One of the greatest things about the CAC world is that it is a community um, of people who genuinely do support each other. And so when everybody working at home, some of that's been taken away, and some of that is such an important part of our own well-being. So I like this framework a lot, and I think it'll be great for people to walk away with.
So I'm wondering, Karen, I'd like to talk a little bit about resourcing. I just have to find where that slide is. I don't have on my screen the little piece to go to the resourcing slide for some reason. Ah, there it is. Okay. Because I think this is another thing that one of the things I really rely on, and it's simple and easy, but it takes at first some presence and some intention and effort, and then I use this in very small ways throughout the day, all the time. So I think I mentioned at the beginning, I'm a trauma trained therapist. And particularly I'm trained in EMDR, so eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which many people will be familiar with. I'm not going to go into that, but one of the things that EMDR does is it focuses or uses what's called bilateral stimulation or tapping. So bilateral stimulation is eyes moving back and forth, or sound back and forth from one ear to the other, or tapping on either side of the body. And so some people may be familiar with a butterfly hug. I'm gonna just introduce you to this now if you're not, because I want to use it as we do this practice. But a butterfly hug means that you cross your arms over your chest like making a butterfly, and then you just very gently alternate tapping like this. It is actually a very soothing gesture for most, and so I'm going to invite people to try that out as we go through this practice. But what I want to say, so just so you know what the butterfly hug is, and to use this at any time can be something, again, that brings us closer into the window. But resourcing, what resourcing is all about, it's a way to strengthen, integrate, and connect to our own internal resources that we have. We all have a wellspring of internal resources that are based on memories or individuals' experiences with good experiences with individuals that may have mentored us or that we are quite connected with. Or if we don't have a direct experience of a particular quality, we have the gift of imagination to be able to conjure that up. And so what this does is that when we are connected with these resources, what happens is that we can then purposefully deepen, strengthen, and call them up to use during times of difficulty. And so it's again that neuroplasticity kind of framework. We can use these resources to really strengthen the neural pathways in our brain and body, so that we can call up these qualities at will. So an example might be we likely all have memories of times where we felt comforted or supported. We all likely have experience of where we may have felt powerful or courageous. We all have maybe images of that represent peace or calm or meaning or purpose. And if we don't, so for example, say, to get through this difficult, challenging time right now, patience would really be helpful for me. And I'm not good with patience. We can use our imagination, right, or think about somebody in our lives, whether it's directly in our lives or somebody who's even a fictional character or like a world figure. Nelson Mandela, I'll often think about him, because talk about a person who could have been so angry and embittered, yet he is this epitome of calm and compassion and gentleness. And so we can imagine this. So what I'll say, and let's maybe just do this very quickly for a couple of moments. So I'm going to invite people once again to become still, to once again connect with their breath. And just taking a moment to think about, during this difficult time right now that we're in, this challenging time of COVID, what is a quality that, if you could be more connected to, might help you weather this storm a little bit more? So that might be a quality of patience, of self-kindness, of courage, whatever that quality may be. Just choose one for the moment. And as you have that quality, take another few moments to think about a situation where you were able to engage in this quality, where you were able, so let's say you were a moment of being courageous. So think of a time where you were able to really exemplify courage. And just noticing, and if this quality is not something that you feel that you've been able to exemplify, let's see if you can think of someone else who exemplifies that quality. Or even if there could be, you could be thinking about an animal even. So perhaps a lion that symbolizes courage, a turtle that symbolizes patience, whatever it may be for you. And just taking a moment to really connecting with that memory or that image, making it real in all its dimensions. So what does it look like? What does it smell like, if that's appropriate? What's being said? So really using your imagination to trick your mind and body to actually being back in that moment, or to being in the presence of this person or image. And taking a moment to notice what's in your body as you connect to this. Noticing the sensations in the body. And if you like, this is where you could bring in the butterfly hug. And gently just alternate tapping to really anchor in this quality, this sensation. And you can do that tapping for as long as it feels soothing. And just before we release the practice, taking another moment to think about a symbol that might represent this quality, or perhaps if there's another person that you are imagining in this situation, perhaps they will hand you a symbol. And if nothing comes, that's okay too. What may happen is something may occur to you spontaneously afterwards, but if there is something that you've been given or that symbolizes this quality for you, just notice that. And now let's release the practice and come back together. And so let me just say, I've got symbols, so that the image here that you see on the slide, these are all little symbols of things that are important to me that I've collected. The bowl up in the corner is filled with heart rocks, because wherever I go, I fill up heart rocks, or I pick up heart rocks on my travels. So I have some from Huntsville, Alabama, when I was there at the symposium, that are in my bowl. And actually, this was interesting. What I noticed myself doing the other day, as I now go into the hospital and I go in in to support the staff that are on COVID affected units. And so I can no longer wear my jewelry, which is often symbolic for me. So I'm taking off all my rings and bracelets and things. And it felt very strange for me. And so what I purposefully did, and I'm sure nobody can see, but I have little, whoops, I have little heart earrings, which I don't think anybody can, well, there they are. And so in a very purposeful way, as I'm doing this thing, so I'm not taking extra time to do it, but I'm being very present to putting hearts in my ears because I want to walk into the hospital with hearts in my ears. I want to listen heartfully, wholly, and deeply. So this is what I mean by the symbols. And again, my screen has gone dark, so if I'm looking wonky, sorry. But
You're fine. We can still
okay,
see you.
so anyway, that's another tool that I use, and I forever have heart rocks in my pocket. So whatever those symbols may be for you, they help us to stay connected to ourselves and connected with each other, because it might be a memory that's related to something that we engaged in with others.
I love that. I think those symbols are so important. I'm finding myself gravitating to things like that as well. And think those visuals, having those visuals around us in our offices, when we're at our offices, it is really just a reminder. It's just a kind of like a touchstone. Yes, so I really appreciate that. Are there any other, because we're getting close to the end of our time together, are there any other grounding techniques or anything that you want to make sure you leave us with?
Yeah, so maybe there's one final slide there that's the checklists that we have on our web page, and because my screen is dark, I can't put them up. So if somebody,
We'll
thank
do
you.
it. We'll
Great.
get it.
So I just want to alert people to, so these are, I think people are familiar with transition rituals. And I think when we work from home, sometimes, with those transition rituals go by the wayside. And so this is a going to work checklist and a coming home checklist. So even if going to work is within our same space, we can still go through the steps. And so there are questions here that will help us connect with, again, with a place of in a place of gratitude, helping us to connect with what's here now, helping us to release the day. So I invite people to take a look at those and use those as needed. I think as well, explore the website for other strategies, but I will tell you, one of my most favorite strategies is one that I learned from Francoise. And that is very much the strategy that we refer to as OMDP, or the 1 minute dance party. And I think what's great about that strategy, especially during times of COVID, is that we think that, yes, of course, we're facing a lot of suffering and so on. But in order to do that, we also need to be able to connect with moments of joy and pleasure and fun, because that's what helps us to be able to navigate the suffering. And so what I love about a 1 minute dance party is, in a very, very quick time, it changes our whole energy, our physical energy, our mental energy, our emotional energy. And this is also one we can do with the kids when we're working at home. I remember when my children were small, we would have our dance parties, and I still have images of my son's quirky dancing, and he would do this thing with his fingers, and so it was just a great release. And so, how can we maybe build in some 1 minute dance parties? I've done it at conferences where, it's always great when at trauma conferences, where then we get 500 people up and dancing our hearts out, One of my favorites, I'll tell you, the last conference, the song Sia Cheap Thrills, if you want to put on that video on YouTube and maybe use that. I think it's a fun little song, and the video is very applicable, I think, to what we're talking about here. So I would encourage everybody to do a 1 minute dance party. The other thing I'll say is to smile. Smiling has a direct connection to that parasympathetic nervous system. And so when we smile, we activate the parasympathetic nervous system. When we smile, smiles are contagious, right? So when we smile, that's gonna be catchy. Even in the hospital now, in our days of being masked, I'm telling people you've got to smile deeper so that the smile comes up into the eyes so that people can see the smile. So that is also that very much we connect with that, and it's a quick thing that we can do.
I love that. And I love these checklists because we talked about that. That's one of the things we've lost. There are just some natural rituals built in with getting up, getting dressed, getting in the car, going to work that we don't have coming home. Oh, look, and you got your computer back right here at the end. Well, Diana, thank you so much for being on this call with us. I think this information is going to be very helpful for all of us, not just while we're at home dealing with COVID and juggling all the things we're juggling, but I think these micro practices are things that we can begin practicing now while we are at home, but these might be want to be things that we take with us after COVID and incorporate these into our daily work and home life for that matter. So thank you so much. We appreciate it, and be well. I know you are embedded with medical units on the front line, and so highly exposed. And so our thoughts are with you and your well-being and that of the colleagues you're working with. So thank you. We appreciate you.
Bye-bye, everybody. It was such a pleasure to be with all of you. Thank you.